At this time, I would like to invite Doug Svensson up to provide a brief overview of our regional and local workforce. Mr. Svensson is a planner and economist with over 30 years of experience in economic development. He has been a principal at Applied Development and Economics since 1987 and president for the past 14 years. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Doug Svensson.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It's great to be here this morning. It's great to be back in Bakersfield. And I guess they'll pull up my PowerPoint. How many of you have had plenty of coffee this morning? I really have to apologize to hit you with economic charts and graphs at 8 in the morning. But I think today's event will be a complete package, and my part of it is to kind of give you an overview of what we see in the economic data in terms of job potential, labor force characteristics, and how we can match the labor demand and supply together. And I think through the panels in the rest of the morning, you'll really hear in depth from the employers the details of what's necessary from the standpoint of developing skills and really getting the workforce in a position where they can compete and gain the jobs that they need. The project that we're working on is sponsored by the Central California Workforce Collaborative, which is an organization of all the workforce development boards in the San Joaquin Valley. And so we've been developing these studies for each of the counties individually and then rolled up into the region as a whole. And this effort is intended to help the WIBs do both their local and regional planning for the new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And so those plans for workforce training programs will be developed this fall and rolled out early next year and kind of guide training and workforce development over the next number of years. There are three major parts to what I wanted to present today. First of all, economic trends and job growth, kind of what we expect to see in industry. We're using information there developed by a group called EMSI. They basically use Employment Development Department data, which many of you are familiar with, but they integrate 80 or 90 other databases together to give us a more detailed picture of what we really can expect for specific kinds of industries. And they also provide projections that are a little more current than what we normally get from EDD. And then secondly, and probably the major part of what I'll talk about this morning, are the labor force characteristics. And there's a heavy emphasis there, as you'll see, on the underutilized labor force. This was something that the CCWC asked us to focus on. So you'll see a lot of emphasis on the unemployed and part-time labor force and what their characteristics are. In order to get at that and look at what some of their work history has been, we were able to access the raw census input, for Bakersfield and Kern County. So it goes beyond what the American Community Survey would normally present. And one additional thing I should mention, because this is done for the Workforce Development Board, the information that I'm presenting today also includes Inyo and Mono counties, so everything that the Employer Training Resource Area provides. But as most of you will recognize, Kern County is the largest employment and population base of those three counties, and so most of the information today will be very germane to Kern County. So off we go. This chart shows labor force at the top, the blue line. The green line through the middle are jobs, and this is from the year 2000 up through the end of 2015. And the red line up and down is the unemployment rate. As many of you are aware, Kern in this area lost more than 17,000 jobs in 2009, basically in the space of about a year or two, which was a very precipitous drop. but by 2012 had actually recovered those jobs and is now at a higher level than it was before the recession. Now that's a little unusual for the Central Valley. A lot of the counties didn't recover until 2014 or later and are still struggling to get back the job base that they had before the recession. In Kern County, we estimate the unemployment rate is now at about 9.8% on an annual average basis at the end of 2015, but that's still well above the 7.4% that it was before the recession. And a lot of that has to do with the continuing growth in the labor force, which is the top line in this chart. You can see that leading up to the recession and even through 2012, you were on a pretty steep growth curve in terms of additional population and labor force. And although the jobs have recovered, it hasn't recovered to the point of creating opportunities for all the people that currently live in the county. That's projected to continue. This chart shows what the Department of Finance at the state level is projecting. The blue line is for Kern County, the red line is for the San Joaquin Valley as a whole, and the green line is the state of California. So you can see that as the recession was ending and a lot of people who couldn't find job opportunities left the valley, so the population growth during that brief period was lower than the state average. But overall, the San Joaquin Valley is expected to have a higher population growth rate than the state as a whole, and Kern County in particular even higher than the region. And a lot of that is anticipated to be people coming to the valley, both at the southern end here in Kern and at the northern end in San Joaquin and Stanislaus counties, as they find job opportunities in the metropolitan areas but look for more affordable housing opportunities in the valley. And so the state is anticipating increased levels of commuting workforce in these communities. And so the challenge to create jobs locally and utilize that labor force will become greater and greater excuse me, as we go forward. This chart shows some of the recent trends and projected job growth by sector. The blue lines are what we think happened the last 5 years from 2010 to 2015, and the orange lines are what's projected over the next 10 years. And I'll go through this briefly, starting at the left on agriculture. Agriculture and food products food processing was one of the sectors that actually managed its way through the recession better than most of the others. For all the discretionary spending that declined during the recession, food is still something that everybody needs, and the worldwide demand is driving continued growth in that sector. But for a number of reasons, we project that to begin to decline, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the rate of growth over the next 10 years is expected to be much lower than it was through the recession and coming out of the recession. Next over is manufacturing, and this is a bit of a bright spot for Kern County. A number of the counties that we've looked at have shown either no growth or actually declining growth in manufacturing. We estimate that the county had over 1,000 jobs, net growth in manufacturing over the last 5 years, and is projected to more than double that over the next 10 years. And I'll talk in a moment what some of those industries are, but it appears to be industries related both to construction materials that are produced here and also to some degree aeronautics activity. Next over, distribution. Logistics continues to be a very important sector in this area, had strong growth and is expected to continue. That logistics relates not only to consumer products, but also food products and other things produced here in the valley. We looked at retail and food services in part so that we could focus in on the economies in Inyo and Mono counties where tourism is more of an element, and also looking at local serving retail as an entry-level job opportunity. So Again, those were sectors that were hard hit during the recession but have really begun to recover. There was a bit of pent-up demand coming out of the recession, so the growth rates are projected to moderate over the next 10 years, but nevertheless remain solid. Professional, scientific, and technical services. Here's an area where I expect to learn myself a lot today. I noticed in the materials at your places that in this last year, this sector actually lost jobs. Over the 10-year period, EMSI is projecting a growth in these kinds of jobs. Again, a lot of it is not only professional services, but aeronautics and instrumentation types of skills and testing laboratories. So that's something that we'll need to keep our eye on to see whether, in fact, those trends bear out. Healthcare, I know we have a panel today, and I think that'll be a very interesting discussion. Up and down the valley, and of course across the country, we're seeing enormous growth in healthcare employment. That's one of the sectors that's projected to actually accelerate growth going into the future versus coming out of the recession. A lot of that is based on new delivery models where we have more dispersed patient care. A lot of those jobs, excuse me, are in residential health care, residential care facilities, and personal services related to health care. In construction, there was a bit of a recovery coming out of the recession. Again, that was one of the hardest hit industries. That's projected to moderate over the next 10 years, but with all the new population growth that's projected, we do expect residential construction to maintain at certain levels. A lot of the positive growth that did occur, or maybe a better way to put it, some of the activity that occurred to offset some of the declines was in public infrastructure construction. There was an enormous amount of investment of public dollars, both from the federal level and from local sources in public infrastructure development during the recession. At one point, we estimated that totaled about $36 billion for the entire San Joaquin Valley. And so there were a lot of heavy construction jobs. A lot of those projects have been built, and now we no longer have ERA funding, we no longer have redevelopment, and some of the other funding sources for that, so that heavy construction sector is likely to decline back to what it was more before the recession. And then finally, education is a strong sector from an employment standpoint, again, serving the population growth as it occurs. So just to summarize some of the employment opportunities that we're forecasting, I mentioned that farm employment had grown well. We expect it to continue to grow at a certain level, but there are a number of trends that are working against it. First of all, as we interviewed employers up and down the valley, some of them farmers, many are concerned about the new state minimum wage and the effect that that's going to have on the cost of labor. That is further accelerating moves toward increased mechanization in farm activities and more of a shift to more kind of technical skills needed in that workforce. So we expect that to reduce the net new job growth in that sector. On top of that, the issue around water and how that's affecting the ability of land to be farmed. All of those things, we expect a moderation in farm employment, but at the same time, food processing industries, many of them still continue to represent an opportunity because we do have a steadily increasing global demand for food. So certain food processing sectors, in this area in particular, milk products, nuts is a big crop and a lot of high demand in the consumer market. And then perishable prepared foods are three sectors that had particularly high job growth in the projected future. In manufacturing, I mentioned construction materials is an area that shows high job growth potential. Aeronautical systems and instruments is another area that we're seeing projected job growth over the next 10 years. Wholesale trade and logistics, we believe, continue to be a strong sector in this area. It's a very important distribution hub, and those jobs will continue to grow. I mentioned professional and technical services. A lot of those are professional services related to serving the population, but a certain degree of those are more technical R&D kinds of jobs. And so that is something that certainly require a higher level of technical background and education. And then finally, healthcare, and I mentioned the trend toward dispersed healthcare delivery and more need for service workers in that field. There are several dimensions that we focused on: the age distribution, educational attainment, ethnic background, and also looking at prior work history among the underutilized labor force. This is just the age distribution of the labor force itself. It's fairly evenly distributed in Kern County, but about 16% of the labor force is either 55 years or older, which is fairly typical of the region as a whole. But as we interviewed employers up and down the valley, many of them mentioned to us the issue of expecting to need to replace retiring workers and how to replace that level of experience and skill with younger workers. And it's a big concern that was expressed a number of times over and over. When we look at the ethnic breakdown of the labor force, the Latino workers tend to have a younger demographic than others, and a lot of the older age groups are dominated by white workers. One of the things that we also looked at was, and this pertains mainly to educational attainment, but also other factors, is the prevalence of non-citizen workers in the labor force in the Central Valley. The CCWC asked us to focus on this in particular. So in this chart, this is just the age distribution for citizens in the blue and non-citizens in the orange. There's roughly 19% of the workforce we estimate are non-citizens. This is self-reported information through the census, so we're not sure it's totally accurate, but it does give us an indication of how people self-report themselves. You'll notice that although the overall average is 19%, in the prime working age of 25 to 54, the percentages are much higher. So those workers are here primarily filling middle school or not necessarily middle school, but prime working age kinds of jobs. Looking specifically at educational status, we see a strong correlation between the level of education and training and employment status. So on the left-hand part of the chart, these are full-time workers. The blue bars are those without any high school diploma, 54%, but there's a steady trend toward a higher percentage of those with some college or college degrees. Whereas with the part-time and unemployed workers, you can see a much higher proportion of those have either no high school diploma or no exposure to higher education. And again, we broke this down for those who have gone through our school system versus those who have come in to the area to work and maybe not had the same opportunities in their home countries. So we can see among non-citizens, over 60% have no high school diploma or equivalent, and many of them just didn't have that opportunity in their home countries. But when we're portraying the Central Valley and this area in general to employers, it's important to sort out that the kids that have gone through the school system here in this area have very similar educational attainment to the state as a whole. And it's but looking at the workforce as a whole, there's a higher proportion of those that did not have that same opportunity, and that tends to skew the data by ethnicity. 90% of the non-citizens are Latino, so we do see a much higher proportion of Latino workers without high school education. We've also focused on other segments of the workforce in terms of workers with disabilities and veterans. Veterans typically have to have a high school education to get into the service, so very few of those don't have that. They have a higher level of education overall. Many employers mention to us that a lot of the skills that they're looking for, they do find in veterans in terms of particularly mechanical maintenance skills and those sorts of things. Among disabled workers, a relatively high proportion have no high school diploma. This includes developmentally disabled workers, so there certainly are probably reasons for that, but it's an additional challenge in terms of integrating workers with disabilities into the main workforce. So finally, how do we put this together? EMSI estimates that on average there'll be 150,000 job openings over the next 10 years in the Kern and Yamono area, so roughly 15,000 per year, 150,000 over that entire period. This chart breaks that down by occupational group on an annual basis. So at the top we have farming, which although there's not a lot of net job growth, there's a lot of turnover. And so there's a lot of openings on an annual basis. Food preparation, sales and related, office admin support. So a lot of these are more entry-level positions. There's a lot of natural turnover there. Then we get into transportation and material moving, which is related to the logistics industry. A lot of that is related to net job growth where that industry is growing. Education, construction, healthcare, installation, maintenance, and repair. That is one that many of the employers talk to us about being the hardest to fill. There are an estimated average of 500 openings a year with those kinds of skills. Many employers looking for those skills, unable to find them. And as we go down the list of fewer openings, you'll recognize that there's higher and higher skill levels, more professional kinds of training required. So we've matched that up with the labor force. So in this case, the blue bars are part-time workers, the orange are unemployed workers. And these are workers that have had some background in these particular occupations. So if they were unemployed, this is the most recent occupation that they had before they were unemployed, or if they're part-time, it's their current occupation. So you can get a sense of the available labor force from the standpoint of unemployed and part-time workers for the types of occupations that are in demand. And there's certainly a match as you go down the list in many senses, but we get down to healthcare and almost no unemployed folks there. Not to say that there aren't any, but in relation to the number of openings, not much of an available labor force. Again, installation, maintenance, and repair is another case where the available labor force doesn't nearly match the long-term level of openings. And as we go down the list, the higher levels of education and training, very few unemployed labor force there. Most of those are part-time. A lot of industries, education and healthcare are two that there is a lot of part-time work. It's an endemic to how those businesses and jobs are structured. And so we get a certain amount of that may not change. But very few unemployed. So in order to make a little more sense of it, we grouped the occupations together. It's a little difficult to look at that level of detail, but if we group all the occupations into three levels of skill, managers, specialists, and support. Managers are anyone with any kind of supervisory responsibility, so they're not necessarily just top-level managers, would be all the supervisory levels throughout the occupational pattern. There are projected almost 13,000 openings over the 10-year period. The unemployed group is about 1,000. And we were having a bit of a conversation at our table earlier. Very hard to match up the actual job requirements to the skills that these folks bring. So there's a lot of opportunity and issues around really matching the background of workers and their skill sets with what these positions require. Looking at specialists, these would be folks with some level of additional training specific to their job. And so it's a wide range of what we would call middle skill kinds of workers, fairly high level of openings. The unemployed workforce is a little more than a year's supply over the 10-year period. A lot of part-time workers in that group. And then for support, these are more entry-level jobs with minimal training directly related to the job, and much higher level of openings in that group. Looking at the educational background for these different groups, managers, specialists, and support, now this is focused on the labor force itself. You can see the managers are the blue bars. There's a steady progression toward higher education levels generally. There are some without high school diplomas, probably work their way up through the business and their profession, but by and large, most of them have some college exposure. Looking at the green bars, the support groups, it's interesting how many have some college or even a college degree and yet are working in what we would classify as support positions. And again, this is the group of the labor force who are unemployed or part-time as of 2014, which is when this data was assembled. And so there seems to be an extraordinary mismatch between the educational background and training for a lot of these workers and the level of job that they've been in or are in currently. So there's tremendous opportunities to work on training that existing underutilized labor force to better match the job opportunities that are available. And just in summary, and this is my last slide, as we've been interviewing employers, and again, we weren't able to do as an extensive survey as you're going to hear today, I think through the panels and in depth. But as we did talk with employers up and down the valley, there were some occupations and skill sets that came up repeatedly in the conversations as being particularly hard to fill. Medical technicians, I think this is primarily because of the volume and the growth in that industry and the volume of openings. It's just hard to keep up with the labor force requirements there. Electricians, maintenance mechanics, that gets back to the installation and maintenance and repair functions. And this is not just manufacturing and industry. I had healthcare people telling me, you know, we have our systems in our facilities. We have electrical systems, HVAC, plumbing, all of that in hospitals, medical facilities. They all need to be maintained. We have the same trouble that industry has in finding folks that can do that. Now, one thing that is more manufacturing-oriented, computer-driven process control operators, is something that came up a lot. It's basic skill of being able to operate machinery off a computer screen, and that's a high level of demand, particularly as mechanization continues in manufacturing. And so that's an area that is particularly important. And then finally, these last two categories kind of get to some broad needs across industry. I mentioned early on the aging out of the baby boomers and the loss of that skill set and level of experience in the workforce. And so there's a tremendous opportunity, perhaps through education and training, to focus on teaching personnel and human resource skills and management skills to younger workers and students so that as they come into the labor force, they're in a better position to move into those supervisory and management positions to replace the older workers who've gotten a lot of those skills through long experience. And then finally, business skills were mentioned frequently. And again, this cuts across industry. It's not just business per se, but all growing enterprises need accounting and management and folks that are skilled in those kinds of occupations in order to grow their businesses. So this applies to healthcare as much as it applies to other kinds of businesses. So in a nutshell, these are some of the overarching conclusions that we heard, and I'm really excited to hear what the panels have to say about the details of what they'd like to see for each of their specific industries. Thank you very much.